over 2 times as much, which made it dangerously top-heavy. Now, you would think that someone would have caught on to that, right? But no, because profits, as it usually goes, were more important than passenger safety. So, at around 8:49 a.m., the ferry starts to turn. And I'm not talking about a gentle sway in the ocean breeze. I'm talking about a sharp turn that throws the whole ship off balance. The cargo wasn't properly secure, and as it tilted, the ferry began to capsize, which means tip-over. Yeah, not exactly what you want to hear when you're trapped in a floating death trap. Many 911 calls were, and obviously they were speaking. But the translations were heartbreaking. Children barely starting their lives shouting, "Save us, we're on the ferry and I think it's sinking. The ferry is tilted and we can't move." Now you've probably been wondering, so where's the crew in all this? Surely they had a plan. Well, let's just say not exactly. In fact, the crew's response to this crisis is where things go from bad to utterly infuriating. First off, the captain, Lee Jun-so, wasn't even in the wheelhouse when the ship started to sink. He was in his cabin, leaving an unexperienced third mate in charge. Isn't the captain's one job to drive the goddamn boat? Oh, I forgot to mention the captain was one of the first people to abandon the ship. Yeah, you heard me right. He threw...
Wil je weten hoeveel jouw auto waard is? Snel en eenvoudig online. Bij wijkopenauto's.nl vul je de gegevens van jouw auto in en ontvang je de verkoopprijs. Niet alleen maar een geschatte waarde. En na een snelle controle in een filiaal verkoop je ons jouw auto. Vraag nu jouw prijs op bij wijkopenauto's.nl.
On his civilian clothes, disguised himself as a passenger and jumped ship, leaving hundreds of people behind. Talk about leading by example. And if that wasn't bad enough, the crew actually told the passengers to stay put. They instructed everyone to remain calm in their cabins, assuring them that everything would be fine. I mean, stay in your rooms as the boat is literally tipping over. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Some passengers obviously ignored them and were rescued. Good for them. Sometimes the experts do not need to be trusted. I'm kidding, don't make this political. By the time passengers realized the severity of the situation, it was too late. The ferry was already sinking fast. So while the captain and most of the crew were already safely aboard rescue boats, hundreds of passengers were still trapped inside the sinking ferry. And these weren't just any passengers. Most of them were teenagers who were following orders, sitting tight in their rooms as water flooded the ship. Like, come on, imagine that you're a kid on a field trip, sitting in a cabin with your friends, listening to the crew, thinking that help is coming. But instead, the ship is sinking, the water's rising, and no one is coming to save it. Now, the rescue operation, well, that was another disaster. It took the South Korean Coast Guard way too damn long to respond. And when they did arrive, their efforts were uncoordinated and ineffective. I mean, this is what the ship looked like. There were helicopters, boats, divers, all things you would expect in a rescue, but it was a chaotic mess. No one was communicating where to be and what to do. Meanwhile, the passengers are trapped inside, slowly drowning while their lives could have been saved if the response had been quicker and more coordinated. And Bob says it gets worse. Out of the 476 people on board, 304 lost their lives. Of those, 250 were high school students. Oh, let that sink in. An entire generation of kids wiped out because of greed, incompetence, and a total failure of leadership. As you would expect, the public was outraged, and rightfully so. The South Korean government came under fire for their mishandling of the rescue efforts and the corruption that allowed the Saewol to operate in such a dangerous condition in the first place. The captain and several crew members were put on trial. Captain Lee Jun-so, he was sentenced to life in prison for murder through gross negligence. Yeah, sounds like the least they could do for a guy who abandoned a ship and let hundreds of people die. The rest of the crew faced various sentences, but honestly, the damage was already done. Crew members
had ik een pistool in zijn mond gestopt en ik gooi hem naakt het ravijn in.
These stories I'm about to tell are some of the worst plane hijackings in history. And let's start off with Indian Airlines flight IC-814. This first hijacking lasted for 7 whole days, during which one of the passengers was brutally stabbed to death and then had their body thrown out like trash. It's December 24th, 1999. A seemingly normal day. And we're here at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, with 179 innocent passengers and 11 crew members ready to take their nice 2-hour flight to, well, New Delhi, 1639 IST. Indian Airlines Flight 814 was in the air. Just like the start of any other flight, the flight attendants were going down the aisles serving each passenger with complimentary refreshments, not knowing that they had just served the passengers who were going to take this whole airline down. 5 men, starting with Ibrahim Attar, Shahid Akhtar Sahi, Sunny Ahmed Kazi, Zahur Mistry, and Shakir were on board IC-814. These men were members of the Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, a super well-known terrorist organization that had ties to the likes of Osama bin Laden. One of the hijackers, wearing a mask, holding a revolver and a goddamn grenade in his hands, got up from his seat and followed behind Anil Sharma, one of the flight crew members, to the cockpit of the plane, 1653 IST. Now the hijacker has the revolver aimed at Captain Davy Sharon's head from behind. All of a sudden, he feels a gun pressed against his head, and a random voice from behind saying that this flight is being hijacked. And guys, we'll get into the demands of the hijackers a bit later. But it only took 3 minutes for the Delhi Air Traffic Control to catch wind of what was going on. They managed to send out a distress signal alerting the authorities of the hijack. In the main cabin, the other hijackers got up from their seats and demanded that the crew take away the food that they have served to the passengers at the beginning of the flight. The crew members didn't know what else to do, so they complied. The hijackers then went from seat to seat down the aisle, screaming and demanding that all of the men be separated from the women and children on the flight. They also ordered that all passengers wear blindfolds. And like you would expect, the passengers were absolutely terrified at this point. Many of them hesitated to follow orders, which is when the hijackers looked at them and threatened them with explosives if they questioned anything that they were saying. The hijacking was going according to plan. Well, at least the hijackers thought. 1804 IST. In the cockpit, the captain grabbed his radio and begged the Indian Air Traffic Control to convince the Pakistani Air Traffic Control to let them land. Why, you may be asking? Because the Pakistani ATC refused permission for the plane to land in Lahore. The problem was that Indian Airlines Flight 814 only had 1 hour of fuel left, which meant that this whole plane was about to come crashing the hell down. Unfortunately, the hijackers overheard the captain talking to the Indian ATC. The men took action to this and began to threaten that they would execute 10 passengers if the plane landed in India instead of the Pakistani airspace. The hijackers hesitantly allowed the captain to land the flight at the Amritsar Airport, an Indian airport that is close to the Pakistani border. 1844 IST. The plane starts its descent towards Amritsar. As soon as the plane landed, the captain quickly grabbed the radio and requested that the refueling be done as quickly as possible. The captain turned to the hijackers and handed them the radio, begging them to say something. But guys, they refused to communicate with the local police. Almost 30 minutes went by and the plane was still not refueled. The pilot turned to the hijackers and could see them visibly getting upset from the delay. But their response was anything but normal. They turn around and storm out of the cockpit into the main cabin. They walk over to the passengers and aggressively pull 7 of them out of their seats. Then they drag these poor passengers to first class, shoving them into the seats and tying them up. 2 of the passengers were Satnam Singh and Rupin Katyol. Then, without any hesitation, the hijackers pulled out a knife. They brutally stabbed both of them in the chest I mean seriously, repeatedly stabbed them. Katyol slowly but painfully bled out in his seat as his blood sprayed everywhere, gasping for air as his lungs filled with blood. And in just a few minutes, he was pronounced dead. He was forced to leave behind his wife Rachana, who was actually on the plane with him. Just sick. The hijackers stormed back into the cockpit, declaring that they have just killed some passengers on board. In a panic, the pilot picked up the radio and made contact with air traffic control 4 times. Screaming that the hijackers had already started killing the passengers, he even threatened to take off from the airport without the refueling, if it meant that it would save the lives of everyone on board. He was terrified but willing to try and save these innocent people. A refueling Bowser was finally dispatched, but it was initially parked to the side. As the plane moved, it was ordered to block the plane from being able to take off. Here's the thing, the hijackers knew that the refueling process would prevent them from taking off. So they turned to the captain and angrily pointed their revolver to the back of his head. They seriously demand...
Breaker Zero toegevoegd suiker. Er is nu echt zero wat je tegenhoudt.
Oh, menstruatie komt snel. Daarom absorbeert Always sneller. Always Ultra. Tot 100% bescherming tegen lekken.
That he takes off immediately. Keep in mind, in first class, 5 passengers were still in their seats with their hands bound, hoping and praying that this whole situation would end soon. Just take a second to imagine how horrified they must be. The hijackers are threatening that they would execute these passengers in first class if the plane didn't take off right now. Again, trying to save the lives of the innocent passengers, the captain listens, despite receiving no clearance to take off. (1947 IST). Captain Sharon is distraught. Did he save the lives of the passengers, or did he just unknowingly kill everyone on board? He radios air traffic control.
We are all dying.
The plane was headed to Lahore. Now, if you remember from earlier, the Pakistani ATC had already denied IC-814 from landing in Lahore. But that didn't stop the captain from picking up his radio and hoping that this time it would be different, because a man on board had already died. And well, they were denied again. The plane flew over the Lahore airport and the hijackers looked outside the window, beginning to fill up with rage, as they saw the lights and navigational aids suddenly turn off, preventing them from landing safely. The fuel was running dangerously low. The captain instantly regretted not allowing the plane to refuel, realizing that now he might have to attempt a crash landing, potentially killing everyone on board, including himself. With fear in his eyes, he looks down at the highway near the airport, accepting the fact that the plane would crash multiple cars, most likely killing innocent drivers. The plane is about to make an emergency landing when suddenly, the Pakistani ATC turned on the lights and navigational aids, allowing the plane to finally land at the airport. 2001 IST. Indian Airlines Flight 814 lands in Lahore. And just as the plane lands, suddenly the runway lights went out and the hijackers realized that they have just been tricked. Why? Because without the lights, the pilot couldn't take off from the airstrip. As the hijackers rushed over to the windows to see what was happening, the Pakistani forces surrounded the goddamn plane. Yep, they were completely trapped. The hijackers started to panic, realizing that their plan had just become unraveled, which is when they finally agreed to release some women and children that were on board. But this time, the Pakistani authorities denied them permission to release anyone. The plane was then refueled and allowed to leave Lahore. 2232 IST. Inside the cockpit, the hijackers demanded that the captain fly to Kabul. However, there was one major issue. When the captain radioed to request permission to land in Kabul, he was informed that the Kabul airport lacked night landing facilities. He sets the radio down and turns to the hijackers and pleads to them that it's not his fault. As the plane flew more west, almost every Gulf country closed their airspace, preventing the plane from landing anywhere. The captain thought that this was it. He had no words. The passengers were crying while holding each other, terrified, not knowing what would happen next.
IC-813, you are all clear to land at Al Minhad Air Base in Dubai. Over.
December 25th, 1:32 IST. The plane has landed in Dubai. This time, the UAE authorities wasted no time and they demanded to speak with the hijackers. The demand was the release of 27 passengers in exchange for fuel. Like you would expect, the hijackers caved in because they just didn't have any fuel. The dead body of Katyal and injured passengers like Satnam Singh were also released. Alright, even though the plane was now in Dubai, the Indian authorities wanted to attempt a rescue by Indian forces, but the UAE authorities refused permission. They didn't want to get into a dangerous situation. The UAE authorities then sent catering trucks to feed the passengers inside, and to also further delay the plane from taking off. But guess what? These hijackers didn't even care about feeding the passengers, and they decided to let them go even longer without goddamn food. These poor, innocent passengers haven't eaten in hours, all while being held hostage. So then the hijackers turned to the captain, pointed their gun behind his head, and demanded that he takes off. This time, the captain thought that he should crash the plane into a building on the runway so that the plane couldn't physically take off. Just as he was about to crash the plane, he remembers that the plane was filled with fuel and the whole plane could explode, literally disintegrating everyone on board and everyone around. 6:20 IST. The airplane takes off from Dubai. The hijackers decide it's time to head to their final destination, Kandahar, Afghanistan. Now, here's where things get even sketchier. Remember, this is 1999. Afghanistan is under the rule of the Taliban, and the international community isn't exactly on good terms with them. But for the hijackers, Kandahar is the perfect place to hunker down. With the Taliban in control, they're pretty much untouchable. When the plane lands in Kandahar on December 25th, the Taliban steps in, offering to mediate negotiations between the hijackers and the Indian government. Yeah, right, Taliban mediators, that's like asking a fox to guard the henhouse. But India doesn't have much of a choice. The plane is now in a hostile territory, and any military action could lead to a massacre. So over the next 5 days, the situation drags on. The Indian government is scrambling to find a solution, but the clock is ticking. And the hijackers are growing even more dangerous with every hour they have to wait. And of course, food, water,
Hoeveel is jouw auto waard? Via wijkopenauto's.nl kun je daar snel en eenvoudig achter komen. Voer gewoon de gegevens van jouw auto in en je krijgt de verkoopprijs. Niet alleen een geschatte waarde. En na een snelle controle in een filiaal verkoop je ons jouw auto. Vraag nu jouw prijs op bij wijkopenauto's.nl.
and other resources are running low. Let's just say the tension is rising. And well, the hijackers made it abundantly freaking clear. Either the Indian government meets their demands or more people will die. Back in India, the government is facing an impossible decision. The hijackers want 3 militants released from Indian prisons. And these weren't some small-time criminals. Like, this isn't some free my boy, he didn't do nothing wrong. No. These were dangerous men. Like full-on terrorists. And their release could lead to even more terror attacks in the future. But on the other side, refusing to comply could mean the deaths of 149 innocent people. Their time was running low, the clocks were ticking. By December 31st, the Indian government was out of options. After nearly a week of negotiations going back and forth, they make the impossible decision to give in to the hijackers' demands. In a controversial move, they agreed to release 3 violent and notorious terrorists: Maulana Masood Azhar, Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, and Mushtaq Ahmed Zargar. These men are flown to Kandahar where the swap goes down. As the prisoners are released, the hijackers let the remaining hostages go. The passengers, some of whom are barely alive after days of captivity, are finally free. For nearly a week, they were held hostage as they watched each other suffer in terrible conditions. They were terrified, hardly ate any food or water, and didn't know if they would even survive this whole situation. And guys, the hijackers, on the other hand, slipped away and were never caught. So what exactly happened after the dust settled? Well, for one, those 3 released militants didn't exactly go on to lead quiet lives. Maulana Masood Azhar went on to found Jaish-e-Muhammad, which has been responsible for multiple terrorist attacks in India, including the 2001 Indian Parliament attack and the 2019 Pulwama attack, which killed 40 Indian soldiers. As for Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, he played a key role in the 2002 kidnapping and murder of American journalist Daniel Pearl. The decision to release these militants sparked a national debate. Has India done the right thing by negotiating with terrorists? Or had they set a dangerous precedent? Who's to say? I mean, I just know that I wouldn't want to make that call. Boxheads, in the comments, tell me what you would have done. Next, we have Aeroflot Flight 3739. This next hijacking is about a family who tries to escape from the Soviet Union, but their hijacking results in the deaths of 9 people. It's March 8th, 1988. Aeroflot Flight 3739 is sitting on the tarmac at Irkutsk Airport in Serbia. The plane is preparing for a short flight to Leningrad, which is now called St. Petersburg, Russia, by the way, for anyone that was curious. And honestly, this day was nothing special. I mean, it was just another typical day in the Soviet Union. It's supposed to be an easy flight for the 76 passengers and 8 crew members on board. I mean, this plane included families, flight crew, and unfortunately for them, a group of hijackers. Little did anyone know this routine flight was about to spiral into a disaster that would end in bloodshed and became one of the most infamous hijackings in Soviet Union history. However, it wasn't just about the hijacking or getting control of the plane. It was more about the desperation from the hijackers. They wanted to escape so badly and gain their freedom from the Iron Curtain Soviet Union, who had control over the lives of millions of people in the USSR. Let me explain that some more before we get into the hijacking details. It's important. We're in the late 1980s and the Soviet Union is going through what you might call a rough patch. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms are shaking things up in ways the country hasn't seen in decades. On paper, it sounds nice, opening the government, giving people more freedom, and allowing for some economic reforms. Because, you know, communism. But in reality, the USSR is a tightly controlled, authoritarian country where people don't exactly have the freedom to come and go as they please. You must get a written approval to take a dump kind of stuff. And so that's where the hijackers come in. Meet the Ovechkin family, with the most Russian names ever. Vasily, Dmitry, Igor, and Alexander, and 7 other siblings. They played music and they were actually in a band together. That will be important soon, I promise. And they were the kind of family that had no intention of just sitting back and watching their lives waste away under the Soviet rule. They wanted out so badly, but let's just say the Soviet Union didn't exactly make it easy for them to just pack up their bags and leave. So the Ovechkin brothers came up with the plan. Hijack a plane and use it to escape to the West. You know, the free people. And they weren't exactly doing this alone. They roped in their younger siblings and even their mother to be a part of the grand escape. Yeah, you heard me right. Mama Bear was on it too. Yeah, Mom, we know Mother's Day is coming up. We signed you up for an all-inclusive spa. Here's the catch. It's not in the motherland. Grab a gun. It's March 8th and the mother along with 10 children of the Ovechkin family have boarded Aeroflot Flight 3739. The flight then takes off at 12:40 p.m. There are 76 passengers on board, so it's not completely full. The flight takeoff is fine, everything's going smooth sailing for the passengers, and nothing suspicious seems to be happening yet. Passengers sit in their seat, read a book or something, or whatever the hell you do in the 80s on a plane. The Ovechkin brothers start looking around the plane nervously, knowing that they were about to turn this peaceful flight into a whole-ass shit show. They were waiting for their moment, and for about an hour, they decided that it's almost time for action. They whisper amongst each other, and it probably went something like this. Bro, you ready, bro? Yes, bro. I'm ready. Let's do it, bro. Get it? Because they're brothers? Anyway, I need you to listen to this because it's pretty damn crazy. Once they were all ready, they grabbed one of their instrument cases and unzipped it. They pulled out a double bass, a musical instrument if you didn't know. And then the brothers grabbed sawed-off shotguns and explosive devices. Yep, from inside an instrument. The brothers hid weapons inside a double bass before boarding the flight. After all, the family was in a band together and they were kind of known locally. So the security at the airport let them through with the big-ass instrument case. The Ovechkins are now armed and dangerous, holding shotguns and grenades. The passengers start to notice those weapons and, well, panic and
Gillette Labs. Our next generation of shaving for the best a man can get.
Dankzij Dreft Platinum Plus plaats je dit en krijg je dat. Dreft Platinum Plus, onze nummer 1 voor hardnekkige vlekken.
ensues. The Ovechkins quickly get up from their seats and rush to the front of the plane. They barge in, aiming their weapons at the flight attendants. One of the Ovechkins then hands a note to a nervous flight attendant. Let me tell you what the note read. Proceed to London, do not descend. Otherwise, we will blow up the plane. You are under our control. The flight attendant nervously holds the note, shaking and scared for their life. In a panic, they sprint to the cockpit and warn the pilots of the danger everyone is in. Alright, so the hijackers' goal is to divert the plane to a Western country. Specifically, they want to land in London or Sweden, anywhere that was far, far away from the Soviet Union. The flight crew was caught off guard but tries to keep calm, knowing full well that the Soviet policy doesn't allow for much wiggle room when dealing with hijackers. I believe their policy is get good. But with the Ovechkins armed and dangerous, the situation in the cockpit is quickly spiraling out of control. The Ovechkins are aiming their shotguns at the flight crew, making their demands known. They are desperate to leave the USSR and will do anything to get somewhere else, like hijacking a goddamn plane filled with innocent people. The hijackers believe if they can get the plane over the border, they'll be home free, embraced by the West as political refugees. But here's where things start to go sideways. The Soviet authorities, now fully aware of the hijacking, aren't about to just let this plane full of citizens land in a Western country, no matter what the hijackers want. The pilots keep flying west, but soon they see that Soviet fighter planes are following them in the sky, with an order to shoot the plane down if it crossed international territory. Yeah, these guys are literally insane. They would do anything to stop their citizens from escaping. At this point, the plane is headed towards Finland, or at least the hijackers think so. In reality, the pilots are flying to a Soviet airbase, Vovchenko, in an attempt to avoid international conflict. However, planes need this little nifty thing called fuel, and it was running out. With their low fuel levels, they're not going to make it to Finland. But the Ovechkins don't want to give up. With the guns pointed to the pilots' heads, they continue to threaten the crew, insisting they head west. More like desperately begging. However, it becomes clear that time is running out for the Ovechkins. Here's the thing about the Soviet Union in the 80s. They didn't exactly negotiate with terrorists or hijackers, or anyone for that matter. As the plane gets closer to Leningrad, the Soviet military is already Here's the thing about the Soviet Union in the 80s. They didn't exactly negotiate with terrorists, putting together a plan to storm the air, anyone for that matter. As the plane gets closer to Leningrad, the Soviet military is already running out. With their low fuel levels, they're not going to make it to Finland. But the Ovechkins don't want to give up. With the guns pointed to the pilots' heads, they national conflict. However, planes need this little nifty thing called fuel, and it was running out.